Philippe Villiers de l'Isle Adam stands on the ramparts of Fort St. Nicholas, the stone vibrating from the subsonic thud of massive Ottoman bombards. The harbor, once a bustling hub, is now choked with scuttled debris, swallowed by the ominous silence of a temporary lull. At the horizon, the sea is an unbroken thicket of Ottoman masts, hundreds of ships forming a wooden cage around the island. De l'Isle Adam stares not at the enemy, but at a frayed map. This fortress was supposed to be unsinkable, but this map is now a detailed obituary. The order is reduced to a final, desperate arithmetic: 7,000 defenders versus 250,000 soldiers commanded by the greatest sultan in history. This is the physical burial of a knightly ideal, where the very stones of their palaces are being ground into the dust they will be buried in. Join the archive for more dark history and tell me below, what era should we unearth next? Just 2 years prior, the Order of St. John held the keys to the Mediterranean as its premier naval power. They were a holy corporation of pirate monks, using Rhodes to choke Ottoman trade and raid coastal cities. To the ambitious Sultan Suleiman, known as the Magnificent, this island was a dagger pointed at the throat of his empire. Rhodes was a masterpiece of fortifications, designed with layered defenses to withstand any siege. When Suleiman's diplomats arrived with an offer of peace, De l'Isle Adam made his ultimate gamble. He burned the offer and prepared to fight, convinced his holy warriors could repeat their past victories. He bet everything on his faith, his walls, and the fragile hope that European powers would unite to save him. Join the archive for more dark history and tell me below, what era should we unearth next? The ambition of the Knights of St. John was forged not in the sun of Rhodes, but in the crusading fires of Jerusalem. The same fanatical fire that demanded they conquer the Holy Land now fueled their defense of a tiny island, thousands of miles from the sepulchre they once protected. They were an order of dualities, monks who took vows of poverty, but who were simultaneously some of the most brutally effective soldiers in the world. Their history was a litany of heroic last stands, creating a mythos where martyrdom was not a threat, but the ultimate promotion. The knights saw themselves as the ultimate bulwark against a tide that had driven them from Jerusalem, Acre, and Cyprus until Rhodes became their final island citadel. They were fighting not for territory, but for a theological mandate they believed was inscribed in stone and blood. Join the archive for more dark history and tell me below, what era should we unearth next? The siege was a duel between two tactical geniuses. Grandmaster de l'Isle Adam was a septuagenarian with the energy of a youth. He was a master of logistics and psychological warfare, maintaining a chilly calm that suggested he had already processed his own defeat as victory. Opposite him was the young Sultan Suleiman, just 26 years old, but already proving to be a ruthless and innovative commander. While de l'Isle Adam was the soul of the resistance, Suleiman was the mastermind of the annihilation. He introduced new strategies of engineering and overwhelming firepower that rendered traditional medieval walls obsolete. Suleiman did not want to capture Rhodes. He wanted to erase it. This was a battle between a dying age of knights and the birth of total war. Both men understood that the true prize was not the island, but the legacy of who was the ultimate defender of the faith and master of the Mediterranean. Join the archive for more dark history and tell me below, what era should we unearth next? Sultan Suleiman brought an army of 200,000 soldiers and 100 war elephants to the shores of Rhodes. But his true tactical advantage was a silent variable that no amount of armor or prayers could counter: the math of kinetic energy and high explosives. The Ottomans deployed massive bombards, including some that could fire 600-pound stones from multiple angles. While the knights could rebuild a damaged wall, they could not rebuild the physical energy that slowly pulverized the stone into dust. The Ottomans had mastered the logistics of gunpowder production, allowing them to fire tens of thousands of rounds, a feat no other army of the time could match. The sound of these massive guns was not just the soundtrack of the siege, it was the physical mechanism of their enemies' inevitable success. Join the archive for more dark history and tell me below, what era should we unearth next? While the world watched the surface, a shadow narrative reveals that the siege was actually a war of visibility and invisibility. While the knights were trapped on the surface, the true fight was happening below the ground, led by the best Ottoman sappers in the world. They constructed invisible walls of dirt that allowed thousands of soldiers to advance to the very base of the fortifications, unseen by the defenders. The knights fought back with countermines, leading to some of the most horrific, claustrophobic hand-to-hand combat of the entire conflict. This was a war of engineering versus ingenuity, where the final blow would come not from a cannon, but from beneath their very boots. The fate of the city rested on barrels of gunpowder, waiting for a single spark to detonate the ground the knights stood upon. Join the archive for more dark history and tell me below, what era should we unearth next? The plan was simple: isolate the island, pulverize the walls, and overwhelm the survivors. The reality on the ground was far more complex. The Grand Master divided the defenses among the 8 tongues of the order, creating internal competition that drove acts of suicidal bravery. Each tongue was responsible for its own section of the wall, turning the island into 8 separate, interlocking fortress nations. This logistical masterstroke meant that even if one section was breached, the others remained intact. It was a masterpiece of organizational theory, but it also created the logistical nightmare of maintaining coordination between groups that spoke different languages. Rhodes was a final bastion where the unity of Christendom was put to the test against the absolute hierarchy of the Ottoman machine. Join the archive for more dark history and tell me below, what era should we unearth next? The siege reached its turning point on September 24th after months of bombardment and a massive failed mine attempt. The outer fortifications were ground to gravel, leaving only the primary interior wall. For the first time, massive Ottoman waves poured through the breach. Suleiman was forced to lead his reserves into the breach personally, engaging in a 5-hour bloodbath where the line was held by a literal wall of dead and dying men. The breach wasn't fixed, it was filled. For the knights, this wasn't a battle for territory, it was a battle for time. Every minute they held was another minute they could hold on to the hope of a relief force, which they now desperately knew was their only hope. The scent of blood was so strong it drifted into the center of the city, a tangible reminder that their defenses had broken down into simple, raw survival. Join the archive for more dark history and tell me below, what era should we unearth next? Sultan Suleiman calculated that after the bloodbath of September 24th, the knights would break, but he failed to calculate their cold religious fatalism. The Grand Master reorganized the entire population into logistical support. Women and children were drafted to carry gunpowder and move cannonballs. He introduced a cold defiance that was purely computational. Every day the walls held was a success, regardless of the cost. He knew the relief army wasn't coming, but his logistics of hope were more effective than his actual supplies. It was a triumph of psychological engineering, allowing the city to function as a machine of war, even as it was being destroyed around them. Join the archive for more dark history and tell me below, what era should we unearth next? Inside the city, the air was thick with friction between the knightly elite and the indigenous inhabitants. The common citizens were not holy warriors. They were just people living in the center of a geopolitical hurricane, fueled by simple fear. Suleiman turned the city into a police state, publicly executing any who spoke of surrender to maintain absolute control. Even among the knights, tension flared, with some advocating for a preemptive suicide attack rather than slow starvation. It was a pressure cooker of clashing worldviews, held together by the single, uncompromising faith radiating from the Grand Master. Faith was the glue that bound a fractured city together against an overwhelming firepower that cared nothing for theological nuance. Join the archive for more dark history and tell me below, what era should we unearth next? Official Ottoman dispatches described the fall of Rhodes as a standard conquest, but the truth was a negotiated defeat, a pinnacle of diplomatic pragmatism. By December, the knights' supplies were exhausted, their walls were gone, and they were fighting a final, desperate hand-to-hand battle in the streets. Seeing both armies decimated by attrition, Suleiman made an unprecedented offer, an honorable surrender. Facing total extinction, Suleiman accepted. The surviving knights were allowed to leave with their flags and relics. This was a political win for Suleiman, preserving his image as a noble conqueror. The invincible myth was preserved, but the knights carried their defiance with them, ensuring that the mythos of their order would survive to fight another day. Join the archive for more dark history and tell me below, what era should we unearth next? Modern excavations around the fortifications of Rhodes still reveal the forensic proof of the siege. Massive cannonballs embedded deep in the ancient stone. Archaeologists have discovered narrow tunnels filled with the bones of young native boys sent down to place explosive charges. Under the Grand Master's palace, hidden caches of coins and jewelry remain, wealth the fleeing citizens would never return to claim. These layers of rubble tell a story of a city paved over, with Ottoman architecture built directly upon the Crusader foundations. The human toll was enormous, with nearly 100,000 casualties leaving a visual scar on the architecture and a psychological scar on the survivors. Join the archive for more dark history and tell me below, what era should we unearth next? Imagine an indigenous Rhodesian citizen, not a knight, huddled in a storage area, listening to the final terms of the negotiated surrender. He is surrounded by the last of his family and the small amount of trade goods they managed to hide, realizing that their divine protectors are leaving. He and his family are now the useless mouths that will be absorbed into an unfamiliar empire, their world changed forever by a geopolitical shift. The shadow narrative is the myth of the knight's defiance. While praised in Europe, the truth was the obliteration of a thriving multicultural city. This was a geopolitical catastrophe, a disconnect between the official myth of a holy last stand and the reality of an abandoned population. Join the archive for more dark history and tell me below, what era should we unearth next? The fall of Rhodes didn't just end a campaign. It shattered centuries of Christian control and redrew the map of global spice trade and naval power. Without this last bastion, the primary trade routes from the east to the west were now under the undisputed control of the Ottoman Empire. The fall of the city signaled the final retreat of the European crusading impulse, paving the way for a century of Ottoman naval expansion. This single decision redrew the map not just of Europe, but of the entire emerging global economy, a scar on time that defined the next century of conflict. It shifted the focus of Christian defense from land to sea and fundamentally altered the relationship between the two worlds forever. Join the archive for more dark history and tell me below, what era should we unearth next? If you were standing on the ramparts of Fort St. Nicholas in 1522, watching the 180 warships close the final gap in your defenses, would you have accepted the Spanish cross to save your people from the fire? Or would you have turned back into the abyss of a lost cause? We judge the knights for their fanatical refusal to surrender, but in the ruins of Rhodes, we see a mirror of our own capacity for total commitment to an ideal. The stones beneath the modern city still whisper the names of those who were willing to burn with their world rather than live in someone else's. Was the myth of their defiance worth the extinction of a culture? As you look at the forensic geometric scars on this coast, ask yourself, at what point does bravery become mass suicide? And at what point does strategic genius become simple cultural destruction? Join the archive for more dark history and tell me below, what era should we unearth next?